Hey everybody,
Good morning.
can everyone hear? Okay? Okay. Thank you. All right, so today again, we resume our look at the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. Me and George. George has decided to attend. Okay, so last week we talked about not praising oneself. And we said that was one half of this seventh precept about not praising self or blaming others. So this week we're going to take up the other half, right? This piece about not disparaging others or blaming others. So the gate for today, gate number 31 says, to work for living beings is a gate of Dharma illumination for with it we do not blame others. So interestingly, Uchiyama Roshi sort of made all the same points in his last lecture on Taiji, and you may be familiar with this, with the text of this lecture because it's around. He made 7 points. But one of the, so here's a bit of a long quote, but here's what he said about this. You have to expect to be trampled on by different circumstances, maybe even for many years. But don't lose your life force under all the pressure. Unless you have the vow, you will lose heart. Only when you live by vow does everything you meet, wherever, whenever, whatever happens, reinforce your life as Buddha Dharma. As long as you have that vow to live out your life wherever you are, sooner or later spring will come. And when it does, you will have the strength to grow. This is the life force. You have to thoroughly understand that this is completely different from selfish ambition. Ultimately, development and backsliding depend only on you. It is really pointless to say that you become rotten because of your circumstances, or that your education is responsible, or that the blame belongs to somebody else. The fundamental attitude of a practitioner must be to live out one's whole self. So that's a long quote, but let's look at it more closely. So he starts out by saying, you have to expect to be trampled on by different circumstances, maybe even for many years. So he's saying, in essence, what? Life is characterized by suffering, right? A familiar theme for us. First of Buddha's Four Noble Truths, life is characterized by suffering. So we have to accept that we will have difficult circumstances. This is the human condition. And then he goes on to say, but don't lose your life force under all the pressure. Unless you have the vow, you will lose heart. So in the face of that suffering, we're going to become discouraged and lose our way unless we're living by vow. So living by vow is the opposite of living by karma. Hojo-san has talked about this quite a bit. Called one of his books, Living by Vow. So this is a kind of a key thing for us, this difference between living by vow and living pulled around by our karma. So here's how Hojo-san describes the difference. He says that part of the definition of a bodhisattva is that this is a person living by vow as opposed to someone who's living by karma. So karma, in this case, is our personal habits, our preferences, the system of values that we inherit from our families of origin, from our culture. We use these things to evaluate stuff, right, and to decide what to do. So when we encounter something, we look at it through all of these filters and we make some judgment about it. It's good for me, it's bad for me, here's what I need to do. Living on that basis is living by karma. Bodhisattva lives by vow, pointed toward Buddha's way. And there are several kinds of vow. General vows are like the 4 vows that we chant at the end of this lecture, the 4 bodhisattva vows, or the vows we take to follow the precepts when either we do a jukai ceremony or we ordain as clergy or something like that. There are also individual vows that are specific to each person. That's not something that we do formally. That's something we do with ourselves, right? So that's sort of between me and Buddha, or between me and me. What's my individual direction? What's my individual aspiration? What kind of practice do I want to be doing? So vows are what drive our practice, right? It's what gets us on the cushion. It's what moves us through the day. Uchiyama Roshi and this gate statement both say that without the vows, we get discouraged when we meet some obstacle in our lives, when we encounter some difficulty. It's easy to just sort of give up hope. So he says, only when you live by vow does everything you meet, wherever, whenever, whatever happens, reinforce your life as Buddha Dharma. As long as you have that vow to live out your life wherever you are, sooner or later spring will come. And when it does, you will have the strength to grow. This is the life force. So when we're being driven by the 4 vows, we always know what our purpose is, right? We always know where we're headed. We get up in the morning, we know what, somehow we know what we're going to do. We may not know exactly what that looks like, But we've always got a compass point, right? We've always got a direction. We know the reason we're sort of moving through the day is the basis of all of these vows, whether it's 4 vows or precepts or what our individual aspiration is for our practice. The first Bodhisattva vow says, beings are numberless. I vow to freedom. That's working for living beings, as this gate statement says. The beginning of this gate statement says, if you're working for living beings, you don't blame others. So this is working for beings, right? Working for living beings. This is this first vow about we're vowing to save all beings, including ourselves. So Uchiyama Roshi says that as long as you have that vow, then your whole life is Buddha Dharma. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Right? It means everything we're doing is practice. It means everything we encounter is the ground of our practice. We're not separate from anything else in the universe, so everything we encounter is ourselves. And on that basis, everything we're doing is practice. So where there's nothing that we encounter that's separate or outside of the Buddha way. So the vow is how we remember to take refuge, I think, in the 3 treasures. It's how we remember to look to our practice for support. And today more than ever, that's kind of important. We're hearing an awful lot about where are our resources, where are our refuges, where are our support systems in a difficult time, right? Living by vow reminds us to look back at our practice and say, that's a support system for me. That's a help for me. That keeps me focused and pointed in a useful, meaningful direction. It's how we remember our place in the universe. It's how we remember that we're interconnected already, beyond anything we think about that or anything we want to do about that. That interconnection is already there. We're already supported by all beings, whether we feel like that or not. Living by vow is how we remember that. So when we remember that, I think it helps some with the discouragement, right? It's easy to think we're separate and that we don't have support. If we remember our vows, we remember that others are vowing too. We're vowing to support each other, and those interconnections are already there. So next, Uchiyama Roshi says an interesting thing. He says you have to thoroughly understand that this is completely different from selfish ambition. So we've talked about selfish ambition, right? I want things for me. I want to shore up this small self because based on my craving and aversion, I want to get things or I want to run away from things. And based on my misunderstanding of the nature of self, I think that there's something permanent here that I have to protect. So, selfish ambition. Again, our aspiration is to work for living beings rather than to be dragged around by the selfish ambition or the needs of the small self or our delusions about self. That doesn't mean we don't take care of ourselves. It means we understand where those cravings and aversions and needs are coming from. So we still make effort, right? We still have a direction, but that direction is not determined by the 3 poisonous mind, greed, anger, and ignorance. It's determined by something else. So what we do instead is based on wisdom and compassion and generosity. We turn those 3 poisons around, they become something more wholesome. So the ultimate yardstick is not necessarily our personal comfort or getting all of our cravings met. Fulfilling all of our desires for chocolate cake and cherry pie. That's not the ultimate measure of success here. Our view of the world becomes broader than that. Our view of the world gets bigger than just me. So in that way, we're living by vow. We're not living by karma. So next, Uchiyama Roshi says, ultimately, development and backsliding depend only on you. It really is pointless to say that you become rotten because of your circumstances or that your education is responsible or that blame belongs to somebody else. The fundamental attitude of a practitioner must be to live out one's whole self. So now we're getting to the stuff about blame, right? Interestingly, the roots of the word blame are the same as the roots of the word blaspheme. So that was really interesting. There's something going on there about unwholesome speech, right? They're not exactly the same, but there's some connecting thread there that says we're not speaking well of other people, right? So the point is it's not possible to blame others for our suffering if we're not separate from them. If we're working on their behalf, that blame becomes less possible and actually, not possible. If we're living out our whole selves, then we're living out the life of the universal self. This is the big self, right? So he's saying if we understand that we are interconnected, if we understand interdependence, if we understand emptiness, and we are living the large life, the universal life, we are living for, we are working for all beings. That means we're not focused on the small stuff, on the small self, the small grievances maybe, the small parts of our brain that go, nee, 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 she did that thing, he did that thing, right? We're not focused on that. We recognize that maybe there's some dynamic we need to do something about, but it's not driving our actions, and we're not tempted to sort of escalate or throw that suffering back. It really means that we also understand right view, the right view component of the Eightfold Path, which is about the nature of suffering and where suffering comes from, how it arises, and what we can do about it. So if we have a really clear view of that, we can let go of clinging to our expectations about how things should be. It's not fair. My life shouldn't be like this. Things should be different. That should is my idea. And just because I think things should be a certain way doesn't mean the universe agrees with me, right? That's my idea. Because I have that idea, I can't necessarily expect that that's what I'm going to see in the world. That's my story. Sometimes we get a bad surprise. We get really caught up in should. She did this thing, he did this thing, it's not fair, it shouldn't be that way. Well, be that as it may, the reality is that is what's in front of me. And that's what I need to deal with. That's the basis on which I need to take action, not my idea about I should have some other circumstances, right? So clinging to those expectations and shoulds and stories is a real ground for the arising of suffering. So when things don't go my way, then the easy response is blame somebody else. It's somebody else's fault. It should have been like this or like that. It didn't happen that way for me. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault, right? We really want to move that blame somewhere else. Probably I'm doing that rather than taking responsibility for looking at the roots of my own suffering. That's easy to say, right? That's not so easy to do. We got to understand there are many things I'm going to say today. Like, that sounds really easy, Karnegis. What are you talking about? Because the human condition is, if we were already doing that, we would have less suffering, right? So we really need to look carefully at how things are happening. This is not an easy process. This is why practice is a lifelong transformative thing. It's why we don't sit down on the cushion and just get it. And, we sit for 15 minutes. They're good for life. These things keep arising, and we get to keep looking at them. So in what ways do we need to take responsibility for our own suffering? Again, I want to emphasize the difference here between acceptance and approval. I need to accept that I have suffering. I need to accept how that's arising. That doesn't mean suffering is okay and that I shouldn't do something about it, right? If there's suffering in the world, job one for the bodhisattva, you've heard me say it before, don't look away, right? That's not easy. We would like to just pretend that's not going on, even when it's here. So we have to look carefully. We have to accept suffering. That doesn't mean we approve of it. It doesn't mean we approve of toxic things that people are doing, right? Please don't fall into that pitfall. I'm not saying we need to be doormats. We need to accept that they're suffering. We need to accept how it arises. Doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable for unskillful behavior, including us, right? So we also need to be careful about using karma to blame victims for their own circumstances. Doju, he's down in the corner here for me, has raised this before. This is a real pitfall. We have to be careful about that. It's been misused in Asian history to perpetuate some oppression, right? Some societal oppression, some injustice. It's easy to just sort of blame the victim. That's also not the teaching here. That message has been that, for instance, people born into poverty or people born with some kind of disability or unfavorable circumstances deserve that pain because of something they did in a past life. Not what I'm talking about here, right? We need to be careful. It's a really harmful thing. So blame might seem like a powerful response to our suffering because there's something that arises for us. There's some anger. There's some strong feeling, right, that comes up, and it's a really powerful thing. And it can feel like we're regaining control when we're blaming somebody else, like we're sort of protecting ourselves or saving ourselves because it's not my fault. The responsibility is completely over there. It's his fault. It's not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. The related message is I don't deserve my suffering. So when we think and feel and say these things, we might temporarily feel stronger. actually those are not positions of strength, right? They reinforce our habits of looking away from suffering or looking away from how our own suffering is arising, ignoring where that comes from. In the midst of difficult circumstances, we are not powerless, right? We get to look at our own response to these things. We need to take responsibility for that piece. So, to constantly be blaming others implies that somehow we're powerless. We're completely powerless about our own suffering, that somehow we're simply at the mercy of a cruel world. And that could really feel discouraging. So, everything would have been fine if only they over there had done something different, done this or that. Well, yes, maybe what they did was out of our control. We had no way to prevent or change or influence what happened. What's not out of our control is our own response to the discomfort that comes up for us when those things happen. That's, again, easy to say, right? It's easy for me to sit here and say that. When we're in the grip of something, it's really hard to step back and say, I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to look carefully at what's happening here. Maybe at some time in your life, you've heard someone say, well, we can choose whether or not to be happy. We can decide how we feel about things. I used to hear that when I was younger, and I just wanted to go, no, I can't help how I feel. Somebody did something to me, and of course, I feel unhappy about that. So it's like, how can I help that? And it's a perfectly reasonable response. So, it's not my fault if I don't feel good about this. There's nothing I could have done. So when we hear these things like, nobody else can make you feel like this or like that, that's kind of cold comfort. Even though maybe in our practice we look at that and say, yeah, that's right, but in the moment, that's not helpful. In the moment when we're having a strong response, the natural response is, I can't help how I feel. There's some injustice. I was treated badly. Something went wrong. Of course, I feel unhappy about that. So without some guidance to understand how suffering arises, and also how peace and contentment arise, we just continue to get kind of tossed around by these strong emotions. Because we forget that the self is empty. We forget that the self is just 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas. We feel threatened. We get defensive. We want to do something, take some action, say something. Maybe we wish we had it later. We look for someone else to blame. It's a defense mechanism. It's an escape hatch, right? So instead, if we can commit to seeing what's actually arising for me in the face of whatever this is, can I see clearly to the bottom of it? Can I see the delusion it's based on about the nature of self? Can I cut off some kind of unskillful response before I go there, before my habituated thinking sort of pulls me into that vortex? Can I take a breath? And can I feel what's happening in the body? And can I see what's arising in the mind? And really make some commitment to look carefully at what's going on. Then maybe we get to see why we feel the need to blame somebody else. And maybe we don't do it, right? What's the fear at the bottom of that urge to throw blame over here? Because it's based on fear, right? So what's at the base of that fear? What are we fearful about that makes us want to throw blame somewhere else? Also, I think we can remember that there are myriad causes and conditions for every circumstance that arises, for everything that happens. The person or the circumstance that we're blaming is in the midst of countless dynamics. We can't begin to get our heads around all the things that are influencing that action or those circumstances. We're only seeing the effect on ourselves, really. That's probably all we can see in a lot of ways. There's much more going on than that, though, right? We need to keep a broader view. It's easy to focus only on, here's the impact on me. Well, what's the entire story? I'm one small piece of the total picture of what's happening in this moment. That doesn't mean that what's happening to me is not important. It doesn't mean I ignore it. Again, I'm not here to say we all need to be doormats for this stuff, but I'm one piece of a much larger story. If I don't see the bigger picture, I can misinterpret what's going on. it's not that my circumstances aren't important, it's not the whole story, which is hard to remember sometimes when we're caught up on our stuff. So what does all that mean in the context of individual practice? In this Dharma family, the approach has been, we are responsible for our own practice. Anyone who knows Hojo-san knows you are responsible for your own practice, right? And as Uchiyama Roshi just said, ultimately developing and backsliding depend only on you. So this goes, back a few generations in our Dharma. Nobody can practice for us. Nobody's monitoring our activities. Nobody's, getting us out of bed in the morning to get on the cushion. What we do, our commitment to our practice and what our practice looks like, is our own responsibility. So we can find a lot of excuses not to practice. We can blame not practicing on a lot of things. We're too tired, we're too busy, we're too old, we're too whatever. We're kind of blaming our circumstances. So there's this push and pull in us, right, that says, on the one hand, golly, I want to practice. I wish I was doing more. And on the other hand, it's really easy to find a lot of reasons to blame for why that's not happening. So, when I was leaving the Milwaukee Zen Center, people used to show up who hadn't been there for a while, and they would always come up and apologize to me. I'm so sorry. I haven't been here for such a long time. I haven't been attending regularly. And then they would give me a lot of reasons. Well, it's the children. Well, it's the job. Well, my car was in the shop. They give me lots of reasons why they couldn't be here, as though they were injuring me somehow or insulting me by not coming to the Dharma Center, And I always said two things. One is, I'm not taking attendance. I'm not keeping a scorecard, man. You're here when you can be here, and you need to be here when your life permits. And when your practice becomes important to you, there will be time for it, right? We get to set some priorities about where we spend our time, and when something becomes important for us, that's where our time goes. So when we're looking at something like structured formal practice, getting on a cushion in a Dharma Center, when that becomes important, there will be time for that. At the moment, what might be important is I have children to raise, or I'm running my own business, right? Or my mother is sick, or something. So, the responsibility for where our time goes is ours. It might not always go where we'd like it to go, but we have to make choices. We have to prioritize. So I always used to kind of smile when people would come and apologize to me for not practicing, as though I was holding them accountable for that. Practice is your job. Practice is your choice and your responsibility. Hojo-san is often told the story of, when he was ordaining with Uchiyama Roshi. Uchiyama Roshi said he never encourages anyone to ordain because being clergy is difficult. So, he says there's lots of meaningless people already in robes. So he's not out there encouraging anybody to take this on, to live this life. He says, if Hojo-san wanted to be a true practitioner of Zazen, he would take him. So Hojo-san says, I still appreciate his reply to my request. It left me no room for making excuses or shifting blame. He was never able to go back to his teacher and say, this is all your fault. You talked me into this thing, right? This is part of the discernment process. And I think this is true whether we're ordaining as novices or clergy or simply living our practice moment to moment, right? Nobody's responsible for requiring us to practice, right? It's our choice. So, when things get tough, as Hojo-san found out, when things get tough, he's got no one to blame. You can't go back to your preceptor and say, this is all on you. It's our choice. So interestingly, after that, when Hojo-san's father met with Uchiyama Roshi on the day of the ordination, he said to Uchiyama Roshi, please take care of my son. This is kind of the formalized thing you do. Please take care of my son. Uchiyama Roshi says, I can't do that. Hojo-san has to practice by himself. He has to walk on his own two legs. So even his teacher was not going to take responsibility for that. To this day, in this particular Dharma family, as you've noticed, Doshi sits facing the wall. Doshi does not sit facing the room, which is more typical. So he or she can sort of look over everybody and monitor everybody. In our family, we sit facing the wall. I went to another Dharma center several years ago. I think I was leading a weekend something. And it was a Dharma center I'd not been in before, not part of our particular lineage. I knew the teacher, but it was some distance away, so it was an unfamiliar setting for me. And of course, they had little platforms where the teacher climbed up on the platform and faced the wall. And the normal, the regular teacher in this place had no idea what I was doing. She was very confused by this. She said, no, turn around. The teachers face the right. I said, not in our family, we don't. So there's a real interesting difference of style there. And again, the reason being, everyone is responsible for his or her own practice, including the doshi and including everybody else in the room. She says he never faces his disciples. Says he faces the Buddha. He walks in the direction of the Buddha. That's his practice. If people want to do that with him, they're welcome to do that, right? If others want to practice with him, then they also need to face the Buddha and walk in that direction as their own practice with their own feet. He can't do that for anybody. So Hojo-san said, I've tried to follow my teacher's example and rely on the teachings and not on the teacher, which is kind of a live question for us in the midst of a leadership transition, isn't it? Because Sanshin is so closely associated with the founder, and everyone's relying on the founder. And that's never what he wanted. He wants us to rely on the practice, not on him. So as we move through the leadership transition, this is a shift we're having to make and helping people to commit to the practice and not to the teacher in that way, right? So to work for living beings is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we do not blame others. What about when a few of those living beings really, really seem to be at fault for whatever is wrong in our lives, whatever is wrong in this universe? It is not easy to just turn on loving kindness, is it? Because blame is related to anger. And it's not like we just flip that switch and that goes away. It's nice to say, well, we need to cultivate loving kindness. But that's not so easy, because we can really look around at our world, no matter when, today or 10 years ago or 100 years ago, we can always look around at our world and say, there's a few people really messing it up for the rest of us. We really have some animosity, because sometimes that suffering is not just my suffering, it's global suffering. It's suffering on a large scale. So it's really difficult to just say, oh, well, I'm going to turn on the loving kindness switch somehow, and not blame those people. It's not easy. Trying not to blame others, again, not the same. Trying not to blame others for our suffering or for suffering in the world, again, not the same as not expecting them to take responsibility for their actions. We're not letting people off the hook by not blaming. That's something else. We can work on discerning the causes of suffering without doing that in the midst of anger and ill will. We can do that carefully. I get that's not easy. It's easy for me to say. Can we look for the root causes of suffering for ourselves, the community, for the world, and do that in a way which still maintains equanimity and still maintains some goodwill, even if it's just for the process? How do we do that? We can start by remembering that the real problem is ignorance, isn't it? When we look at three poisonous minds, the real problem is ignorance. When people don't understand how the world really works, when they don't understand the real nature of self, this is not to say we are better than others because we study these things, right? But we simply look at ignorance. We all got ignorance. When we don't understand that stuff and others don't understand that stuff, then unskillful action happens. We make mistakes. We do it and everyone does it. We all fall prey to those three poisonous minds, right? That suffering, that resulting conflict, whatever it is, we want to blame somebody for, based on those three poisonous minds that are part of the human condition. We've all got that stuff going on. We've all got these myriad causes and conditions that are affecting what we do, how we respond to things. That person taking some unwholesome action, resorting to some unskillful action, perpetuating suffering from others, is in the midst of a lot of dynamics, as we all are. It is not simple. We can look at a circumstance and think we know exactly this led to this, led to this, led to suffering. Well, maybe not. There's probably a lot of other stuff happening. There's a much bigger picture happening, bigger than what I see, bigger than the effect on me. There are responses sort of wired into the primitive parts of our brains as human beings, things having to do with craving and fear and aggression. It's what we inherit. It is our karmic circumstance when we're born in this form. There are some things that are hardwired into the brain. Those things might be amplified by our temperaments, by the things we inherit from our families of origin, by the value systems we get from the culture. Whoever it is we're blaming for whatever they did didn't choose any of that, right? They were born into a human condition, born into some circumstances. They didn't choose that. Doesn't mean it's okay for them to be unskillful. But if we back up a little bit and we say there's some stuff that we really didn't choose for ourselves and others didn't choose for themselves. Those are universal challenges of the human condition. They don't belong to any one person. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to blame somebody for something that we all share. The person we're blaming is not the sole instance of craving and aversion, right? It's not the only place that stuff resides. It's not his or her ignorance or greed. It's the ignorance and greed of the human condition. Maybe we can cultivate a bit of compassion when we can approach things like that for someone who's hijacked by delusions, hijacked by fear. We've all been hijacked by fear. Maybe we get to step back a little bit and have a little bit of compassion for somebody. If we can, then we can still have benevolence toward that person. We can still wish that person well without agreeing with what they're doing, without letting them off the hook. In a previous talk, we talked about benevolence. We said that wishing somebody well, a bodhisattva wishing somebody well, means we simply wish for them to be liberated from suffering. Well, if we're bodhisattvas, we wish that for everybody. We want everybody to be liberated from suffering, no matter what kind of things they're doing. We can wish that for everybody, that he or she will wake up and see clearly and take good action and let go of suffering, even if it's somebody we don't personally like very much, which is kind of a conundrum. That's a real challenge. How do you wish somebody well that you really don't like very much and that you think is responsible for some pretty scary stuff? That's a really deep bodhisattva practice. We can also remember that we don't always know somebody's motivation. This is part of this whole thing about causes and conditions and dynamics. We don't know why necessarily somebody took the action that he or she took. We've heard many times that something done with the best of intentions can go awry and can create some suffering. Not what anybody intended, but something went off the rails. As bodhisattvas, if this is us, we take responsibility for what we do. This is why we have vow and repentance, right? Because we put an action out there, the best of intentions, we might get blamed for it because something might go wrong. We have to take the vow and do the repentance, and take the vow and do the repentance. And these two practices are not separate, right? And this is why, because our practice is never going to be complete. So this is how we take care of this dynamic in our practice. People outside of our Sangha might not have a means like that to consider what they do and how that affects other people and how that dynamic works. We might have to just be patient with people who are not at the point where they're looking closely at that stuff and maybe can't even discern their own motivations sometimes. So again, blaming somebody and holding somebody accountable, not the same thing. Blame comes with some ill will. Blame comes with some anger, or at least with some ignorance. I'm blaming somebody because I'm looking away, or I'm not taking responsibility for my own response, or something. That's a very complicated situation. So blame has this kind of unpleasant feeling about it. Holding somebody accountable doesn't cut off the relationship, interestingly, right? If I'm blaming somebody, I'm putting them over there. Blame says, I want to be separate from you. I want to be separate from you and what you do and everything about you. I'm really drawing a line and creating some separation. Accountability says we're interconnected because we can't help it. That interconnection is already there. You might have done something that had an adverse impact on me, but it doesn't sever the connection. Now we have to figure out how to work together, right? Because that connection is there whether we want it or not, because all beings have this interconnection. So we have a relationship and we have to figure out how to make it work. And that is working for living beings. That is the working for living beings which keeps us from automatically blaming, right? Because we have not severed the connection. So rather than blaming others for things, maybe we can point to ignorance as the real culprit, as the real problem. If we do that, then there aren't human enemies out there. We might want to be working to resolve ignorance, but we're not working against other humans. We don't have human enemies out there. There's just a lot of confused people in the world that need some help. And again, we have to be careful about, I'm going to reach down and help you because I'm better than you. That's not the dynamic we're working for here. We simply need to recognize there's a lot of confusion in the world. There are a lot of people who don't know what to do next, are taking action based on not understanding the nature of self. As bodhisattvas, what can we do to help? That doesn't mean we're going to teach everybody to sit zazen. Not everything is a teachable moment, you know. What can we do at least to not make the situation worse? So this is where our bodhisattva vows come in. Can we vow to see all beings as falling prey to the three poisons? Can we vow to see that that's what's going on, and not to take something immediately personally, which says, I'm blaming you for my misfortune, I'm blaming you for my problems. We can continue to work for living beings in this way, even if we don't agree with what they do, right? So, can we continue to work for living beings, watch this dynamic about blame, choose to do something else? Right? Enough from me. What would you like to say about any of that? I think there's plenty to chew on. Probably people have some responses and questions. What would you like to say?
I guess I could say one thing. So when you said that, you know, sort of maybe what it boils down to is that we just have to be patient. I just had a Japanese test the other day, so that reminded me that, you know, one of the words that we learned recently, which is patience in Japanese, it's gaman, and it literally means like sort of, the first ga is like the self or like the ego. And man is sort of like slow or enduring. And so the idea is sort of like you are kind of suppressing the self or the ego in being patient, which I think, you know, applies here as well. Of course, when we choose not to blame someone, we're doing the same sort of thing. We're slowing down the process of the ego or suppressing it a little bit. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting connection.
That is really interesting, isn't it? Because it is about not jumping straight into habituated response and habituated thinking, right? Can we slow that down enough? And we've talked about it plenty here. Can we open up just a little bit of a gap to say, what's my ego doing here? And is it the best action? Is it the right action? You know, there's no one response to any of these things. You know, the question is, can we look carefully? Can we slow down the ego enough? And can we have the patience to not go immediately to the habituated response? I think so much of our practice is about noticing that coming up, no matter what the response is, because we have, you know, lots of habituated response. To even begin to be aware that there is a habituated response, and, you know, is that really what's going to serve us best in this moment? It's a huge practice, because it might be blame, but it might be anger, it might be ill will, it might be lies, it might be stealing, right? It might be breaking any precept in the book. It's like, can I watch the habituated response? That's hardwired into the human system in some ways. This is not a simple thing to do. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Other things people would like to say today? We've got a brain science guy in the room. You want to say anything, Jeff, about any of this?
I have a question first. You had said something at one point, I hope I got this right, when you were talking about not blaming. It had to do with not expecting the other person or other people to take responsibility. Is that what you said?
I was making a differentiation between paying attention to my own response and not necessarily leaping toward blame is not the same thing as not expecting people to take responsibility for themselves.
Yes.
I'm not letting people off the hook by saying I also need to pay attention to what's arising here. Because what that person did might have been really unskillful, and there might be some consequence, you know? I might need to call the police. But that's not enough, right? I've also got to pay attention to what's happening here. Am I also responding in a skillful way or in an unskillful way, or in an unhelpful way? Does that help?
Yes.
Because, sometimes it's easy to read these things or hear people say this stuff and you think, well, does that mean that I can't take care of myself? Does that mean I have to be a doormat? Does that mean I should be ignoring my own sort of psychological needs? Well, no, this human being has psychological needs. That's what goes with this human form. We have to be aware of that and take care of it. We also have to see it's not the whole story. It's not about ignoring this. It's not about saying my suffering isn't important or that what everyone else chooses to do is okay with me. Not at all. We wouldn't have something called engaged Buddhism in this country and around the world if that was the teaching. Buddha never said, lie down and take it. He said, look at suffering for yourself and other beings. Did you have a follow-up for that?
I just needed clarification, but what Doji was saying, this has been on my mind, as sort of neurologizing these things, is that I've gotten real interested in the last year or so in the side of the nervous system that does the patience, so to speak, metaphorically. And what's real fascinating to me is that among other parts of it, it's the part that's associated with exhaling.
Oh.
So I don't want to go into the details are fun, but this is the time for it. But there's a difference in the two sides of the nervous system when you inhale and when you exhale, and it's all reflected in heart rate. And what Doji was saying could easily be translated into this interplay and the balance between these two sides of the autonomic nervous system. So to play with the brain scientist side, that's this very, very pretty parallel that exists there in our bodies.
Interesting. Well, it makes some sense, doesn't it? In this practice, we're frequently told, well, take a breath. Before you jump into habituated thinking, take a breath. Next Wednesday in our evening book discussion group, we're going to talk about the chapter on breathing. So we're going to talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah.
There's no separation here, mind and body. So if we can notice, and it's ironic that I'm saying this because I live in my head. My body awareness is very, very low. So I have to pay more attention than anybody to what's arising in the body because I really tend to ignore it. If I'm feeling unhappy, uncomfortable, uneasy, what's going on here? Because there's some early clues about what is my breathing doing? Am I, contracting the body because I'm protecting the self? There's all that stuff going on. So for somebody like me who doesn't go there easily, that's a very conscious, it has to be a very conscious practice. So yeah, it's interesting stuff, isn't it?
Great.
Other things people would like to say this morning? Sagan's got a hand and then Tony.
Yeah, this is kind of trivial, but the word patient, the etymology of patient basically means suffering. So a patient person is one who's suffering in a sense.
Really? That's interesting. So can you say a little bit more about that connection?
Well, I mean, it's just the basic, the verb patior, or patior means I suffer, I am suffering. And the same etymology is for passion or compassion, suffering. But basically patience means, the capacity for suffering.
Or maybe the acceptance of suffering.
Hence the expression, he doesn't suffer fools gladly, right. Same kind of thing.
Yeah, he's not patient with fools. Yeah.
I love it. That's interesting. I see Jeff's gone for a book, so we're going to hear from him in a minute or two. Tony, did you want to jump in? You're muted, by the way, Tony. You're going to have to unmute your mic.
Okay.
There we go.
Well, I hadn't deliberately or consciously raised my hand for that. I was, resting my chin. But having said that, I'm bothered by a couple things. That's too strong a word. But anyway, I'm still wrestling with the notion of talking about our practice in terms of being bodhisattvas. And bodhisattva, I have trouble with this as a reference place, a reference point. Part of it, and that partly relates to a lot of what, you know, we're learning here, and we have to learn, listen, and so forth. But the implication is, you know, remember this, do that, do something else before you look before you leap. Makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that relates to well, you have a particular place, a hot spot, so to speak, and you know, you're not speaking to me individually in a room or somebody else. You're talking necessarily in terms of people, you know, lots of people, all people, or something, which means it has a sort of an inherent universal cast, a universal implication. And yet that's questionable, at least in my experience, that we can make a statement, you know, from any authority. GM Roshi says this, somebody else says that. It seems to me what's required or what's called for is a sort of it's a spin on the scientific method, so-called. You know, you have these great hypotheses and everything's going great down until, you know, at some point it doesn't fit in with reality. You know, it's a beautiful theory. It's a beautiful, wow, fits, model, da. But if it, you know, how does it stand up against, you know, everyday life, so to speak? For when I hear the teaching as you're reading it and so forth, it's like, you know, the person's angry, you know, okay, I have to stop here and I got to think about this. Well, what do I want to, and I don't know very many people that do that or have the time to do that. I mean, we have to, we have to do something. What should I do now? And I think if we're trying to help, I don't know about helping one person, like you tell me or you tell Sagan or vice versa, whatever. But as a universal statement, I think we're thin. It's pretty thin. We don't, what I would like to hear is teachings that a person can learn well enough or shallow enough, if that's a word, that they can refer to right now, even though they don't know, in quotation marks, all this stuff we're learning. Because that's what most people, including myself, but that's what most people I'm around run into. There's just, we necessarily, I guess, lose track, even though you bring it up in many ways, the dynamic of things, that things are always moving, you know. It doesn't wait while I ponder this. Okay, now we'll continue on. So if we're going to help others and ourselves, I think, well, speaking for oneself, myself will say, what I look for or listen to get is something that I can remain with my short-term memory as it is. And that will carry me along without, well, you've mentioned this, don't make things any worse. You know, I may not make them better. I may not go in the direction of a bodhisattva, but it's pretty sure I won't make them worse. I don't go in the direction of Mara or whatever her name is, you know, whatever Buddha's counter is. You know, I'm not making it worse. And so we can act with a certain amount of confidence. Even though I really don't know the whole picture, I'm pretty sure about this one little thing. If I don't smash him in the nose, that's better than if I do smash him in the nose. And I think that's what we'll say newcomers to Zen or something like that are looking for as well, because we mentioned, you mentioned the group in Milwaukee and so forth, that they are looking for, I was, and I think more than newcomers, but it's, all this makes eminent sense, but I can never call it up when I need it. The things are moving too fast. What can I call up? Benevolence, or maybe something like the difference of this questioning the use of the word patience. By the way, I guess this is a good place for me to stop. By the way, Suzuki Roshi, maybe in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, well, but I heard him say it, I can't remember, but he said that he thought patience was not the word he wanted. He could not find the translation he was looking for in the usual definitions of patience. And so again, he went back to his use of the word acceptance, real acceptance as a starting point. Well, I do, acceptance, and that I just throw that out as a little addition to the discussion about patience. Yeah, he said it's not whatever it was that he was talking about. And maybe it was kindness. I don't know. I can't remember. But he said he thought better than in English, the notion of patience was acceptance. So done.
Okay. Well, you're throwing out lots to chew on. I agree with you that in the heat of the moment, engaging in an intellectual exercise is probably not possible and maybe not helpful. So when you're in the middle of something, you're probably not going to sit down and start trying to remember, all the written teachings you've ever heard. So just in the course of our day-to-day practice, whether that's getting on the cushion, doing beneficial action, doing our Dharma study, which is the 3 things we do at Sanshin, somehow something seeps into your bones, which changes your perception or not your perception, changes your outlook or your, I don't know. And because you've been immersed in Zen for many, many decades, my guess is something has changed for you, in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Maybe you're not even aware of it. This is not a quick process. It's not something we memorize. It's about immersion. And having said that, it's helpful sometimes to focus on one aspect, maybe, of teachings. Maybe there's a key word. Maybe because we can't, in fact, I just had this conversation with somebody the other day. We can't bear all of this in mind all the time. I mean, it's just not possible. Look at all the myriad teachings that there are. We can't possibly keep it all in our heads. It might be that for a time we work on one specific aspect, and then maybe for a time we work on another specific aspect. So it might be simply for the next, 2 weeks or a month or 6 months, my practice is going to be to remember interconnection. So when I'm confronted by something, what's the piece here about interconnection? Or it might be, I'm going to remember impermanence. Or I'm really going to work on gratitude. Or I'm going to, it's like pick something. Because we can't possibly keep all this stuff in our heads. And it might be that in the moment that we feel triggered, we need some refuge to go to. And I think it's different for every person. I think it depends on where we are in our practice, where we are in our lives, what our karmic circumstances are. For me, maybe what I want to say is I don't pay attention to my body very well. Maybe for the next 2 weeks or a month or 6 months, I'm going to commit to what's going on here. I'm going to pay attention to that because I recognize that if I don't pay attention to this, I get hijacked and I do something crazy. Maybe this is where I'm going to focus for a while, right? You can sort of take it as a personal ongo. Take it as a personal practice period. And by the way, we can do that for a lot of things that are going on in our lives. When my mother was terminally ill, she was terminally ill for about 6 months. She got sick and very quickly she was gone. I took those 6 months as an ongo. I didn't have time to go to the Dharma Center. I had to go to work and I'd take care of my mother. That's all I did. But I said, I'm going to take this as an ongo, as difficult as this is. And I know that there are people who have taken the pandemic closure as a kind of a retreat and said, for the period of this time, I'm going to work on, this thing. I'm going to do this kind of study. I'm going to do this kind of practice. I'm going to bear this particular teaching in mind and really sort of delve into what that means for me on a moment by moment, day by day basis. So maybe there are some things we can do to prepare ourselves. It's kind of like disaster preparedness. I do disaster relief for the Red Cross. I have friends who do other kind of disaster preparedness in their communities. It's the same as when we learn CPR or something. We learn it so it's there when we need it. We're not learning it because we're going to go, want to use it every day. But when we need it, that's not the time to get out the book. I remember I've heard lots of people say things like, it's good to learn how to use your fire extinguisher, like now, because what happens is the fire breaks out, everyone picks up the extinguisher and they start reading the instructions. Meanwhile, the whole place is going up. Or they, spray the top of the fire rather than the bottom of it. It's like you need to know that stuff before you get into that conflagration. And practice is kind of like that, I think. It gives us the tools. We can try to be clear-headed. We can try to cultivate some useful qualities. or at least start to recognize when the less wholesome things come up, so that in the heat of the moment, something is there. We're not having to go look it up in a book or try to remember what my teacher said. It's like, I know what to do. It's here. Does that make some sense? And is that helpful for people? And would anybody else like to say something about that? How are you practicing with the kind of things Tony's talking about?
I'll say a little bit.
Good.
Years ago when I took precepts with my first teacher, I remember at the end of the ceremony, there were 5 of us that were taking the precepts together. And part of her lecture was about once you take the vows and the precepts, you try to foster a way of engaging a no negotiating stance with yourself. And it's something that comes back on me all the time. And something I've been dealing with a lot lately is, and you just saw me maybe get up and I picked up a mouse trap. It's a live trap. And I took it over to the door because it's sitting in the light here and concerned about the mouse overheating. So I've got to do something with it. It's kind of poses a problem, I guess, because in this it says to work for all living beings. Within this gate, we're talking about to work for living beings, to work for all living beings is what that means to me. This time of year, it gets really hard. Got ants in the sink. What do you do with those guys? You know, how do you get rid of them? How do you stop them? Unfortunately, you kind of have to kill them because they just don't go away otherwise. And so it's a health issue for you. But still, there's that consideration about how do you mindfully do this? How do you take care of this problem? How do I deal with the mouse? I take him down the road, let him go into the woods, you know, that sort of thing. So I just kind of felt like that was an aspect that we hadn't really touched on yet.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can respond to that.
Well, this is a pointer back to this teaching that we cannot exist without the support of other beings. And so we need to take some responsibility for that interconnection. And again, this is why we do vow and repentance. We may have to kill the ants. We may have to weed the garden. We may have to pull up things in order for ourselves to survive. We're surviving because of the giving of those beings. And sometimes we're in a situation where we have to take some action like that, which ostensibly breaks a precept. What do we do? That's why we have vow and repentance. And so we recognize we're living because of giving of other beings, right? So yes, we want to be mindful about that and not indiscriminately, you know, kill whatever. But when that needs to happen, we take responsibility for that. You know, Hojo-san tells the story about digging the well. I think it was Pioneer Valley Zendo. They were digging the well and the skunk fell in and drowned. And he said, you know, I didn't intend for that skunk to drown. I had to take responsibility in some way. You know, that being gave its life so that we could have water and function here as a Zendo. So that interconnection has some interesting ramifications, doesn't it? You know, if you build a house, I remember, you know, years ago when I was married, we built a house and we found ants in that house for like a year. Why? Because there were ants in the field. You know, they were in the wall. I mean, what could you do? You build in the natural environment, you've got beings. You know, I get the odd mouse in here too. You're building in their environment. What are you going to do? So our challenge is how do we approach that skillfully? You know, how do we do what needs to be done without anger and ill will, and we take responsibility for the fact that we are supported by all beings? But it's not easy, and it's one of those ongoing conversations in Western Buddhism. It'll very quickly go to what about vegetarianism? It'll very quickly go to about, you know, what about the leather in my sneakers? I mean, we could spend all day. Because these are big questions. They're truly big questions, and we're wrestling with them all the time. You know, so our challenge is how do we do it skillfully? And I can't just give you an answer. You know, I can say it's a live question. Other things people would like to say? Tony?
Normally, I don't like to add on stuff, but listening to Michael's experience brought up something else. Was it last week or the week before we were talking about a yardstick referencing traditional measuring something, our behavior, this or that, along with the notion of what shall I do? I think we need to, at some point, check out, should I look at, did I do enough? Because then I think we're off the base again. I think another thing we need, or I need, is a reason to, well, definitely to practice repentance, and not because I have to or it's a good idea. It feels right to do that. But anyhow, not to question repentance, but just the fact that I do the best I can and then forget it. Because a matrix for my behavior, which is, you know, I'm hoping is in accord with the teaching, is as much a hindrance as, you know, checking against, you know, other people's standard of behavior for what I should or shouldn't do. I think if we're practicing in accord with the Buddha's teaching and so on, there needs to be, I don't know what basis, this is where you guys come in with the better vocabulary, a basis for, well, just doing it, which is often repeated in Zen, just do it, la, la, la. But, you know, to get away with that with our own mind, I need a reason, sort of like, can't measure it. You know, live with cause and live life. That's one I remember. Live with cause, some monk said, and leave effect to the great law of the universe. I think there has to be some acknowledgement of, even with the best of information, I could be wrong. But I'm gonna do it anyway. If I have to go to hell, as we've seen in Zen stories too, okay, I go to hell. Otherwise, it's too constraining, it's crippling, and it's not helpful. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly we use the best information we have, you know, we make the best choices we can make. We take skillful action to the best of our ability, and we can't possibly know the outcome of that because causes and conditions are huge, right? All we can do is have our aspiration to do the best we can, moment by moment by moment, for living beings, and we throw it out there, and then we have to let go of it. And that's really difficult because we want to be rewarded for it, or we don't want to be blamed for it, or we don't want to take responsibility for it, or, you know, something, because it's very complicated. That's really tied up with our ideas about self. So can we just take a selfless action to the best of our ability, not be martyrs about it, by the way. Again, we're not talking about that kind of pathology. You know, martyrdom is just another ego trip. It's just another idea about who I am. So this is not about self-sacrifice for the sake of a story. Right? We're going to do as much as we think we should. We're going to do the things we think we should do, and then we're going to let go of them. We got to throw them out there and let the universe do what it's going to do. If there's a good outcome, we don't have to puff ourselves up about that. If there's a bad outcome, if we can help, we help. We don't run away from responsibility for that because, again, something done with the best of intentions can have some unexpected outcome. So we don't really know what the result of that is going to be. And moment by moment by moment, that's changing because everything is impermanent. So it can be difficult. But of course, on that basis, then it's very difficult to take an action which is about my identity, my self-identity, because everything's changing all the time. So I'm going to do this action and throw it out there. And it's not mine, right? It's, you know, I did some action and something's going to come out the other end. Did we do enough is a live question. We can't really know that. You know, to have right effort and to be diligent is all we can do. We're also limited in this human form. We cannot save all beings, and yet we vow to do it at least once a week, and sometimes more. We cannot enter every Dharma gate. You know, we can't read every Dharma text ever written. We can't do every beneficial action that there is out there to do. We have limited human form. We do what we can. Without getting stuck, and that in itself is a huge practice. And that's why beneficial action is one of the three things that we work on at Sanshin. It's one of the 3 parts of the mission, because to really understand beneficial action is kind of a life project in itself. Right? So there's no easy answer to what you're saying, but I think you raise a good point. We have to do the best we can, not knowing what the outcome is. And for us, that's not easy, is it? We want an outcome. We want an outcome for all beings, just like we want an outcome for ourselves. And we have to just kind of open the hand of clinging to that kind of goal. And that means that it can be difficult for us to know what right action is, because we're not getting the reinforcement, or we're not getting the reflection back always that says that was a good thing to do. We might plant a tree, that's going to grow and come to fruition in 100 years. Well, we won't be around to see that. Do we know that was a good action? We don't know. There may be no way to know that, right? It really is an exercise in not building self in a very interesting way. Other things people would like to say? Everyone talked out this morning? Okay. Let's do our closing chant, and then I'll pitch to Hoshin in case we've got some announcements. And I think that's it for today. Thanks for a really good discussion today. Please stay safe this week. We'll see you at something during the week, or maybe next Sunday. Hoshin, over to you.